welcome to When Death Awaits, a conversation with Uncle Rich, former LA County Sheriff's homicide detective, 32 years of service, 17 years with the Homicide Division. He's going to take us through another compelling, exciting, terrifying, disturbing case today. And you know, he'll take us through, hopefully, I hope, many more. But let's jump right in. I'm Umar.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Rich Ramirez, retired LA County Sheriff's homicide investigator.
All right. Let's get in. Uncle Rich, tell us a little bit about what you're going to be taking us through today. And I think from our perspective, this will be interesting for those who are true crime fans, aspiring law enforcement, perhaps even law enforcement, criminal law junkies. This case kind of has it all. And, you know, the little disclaimer that if you're a parent, there might be a little bit of a pit in your stomach listening to some of this, but you know, I think there's an important outcome here. Uncle Rich, I'll let you take it away.
You know, I would just say this, Umar and Chris. From episode 1, it's interesting. I notice myself, and a lot of times, appearing as though it's almost on the level of humor. And I want to let you guys know right now that even though I'm laughing, the reality is that this is psychologically devastating to me. And I live with these cases, and I continue to live with these cases and see the devastation that one human can do to another. And I want to preface that because when we talk about this particular case, this was even more heart-wrenching and heartbreaking. The heart-wrenching part was finding a lone female in a bedroom who had been brutally abused, and at the same time learning that there was a 4-year-old who witnessed this thing, and I didn't know where he was. And as we go on, I will explain what happens. And that's, I think, is how I want to preface this story, because there is no doubt that when it comes right down to it, it's all about trying to prevent these things from happening again. Because we already know that we cannot stop this kind of experience, but we can prevent it by capturing the individual who actually did this and bring him to justice, and hopefully, and I use the word hopefully, convict him in a court of law. And I say that because there are many issues that are abound, and in particular this case, that we'll find intriguing and in some ways challenging by way of a conviction. So with that said, I'll just go ahead and start basically the story, and I think I just wanted to preface that because I think anytime, and this goes for anybody in law enforcement, anybody for that matter who has any kind of sense of humanity, when it comes to kids, you're like, wow. And I've handled a number of child death investigations, you know, and it's heart-wrenching to, and I use that word again only because it does in fact have such an impact on me, is when you find kids that are either witness to an incident or in fact are victims of an incident. And that to me is psychologically draining, to say the least. But go ahead, Omar, we'll talk about this thing. And I just, you know, I appreciate you guys even allowing me to talk about this, because to me, it's cathartic in a way. In terms of the psychological aspects to this. And so that's what I want to touch on. Basically, and like I prefaced from episode 1, I get a call. I'm basically on call that day, and it's around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. And I drive up to the scene and it's an apartment complex in Montebello. And as I get there, I learn that it's an upstairs apartment. And when I'm directed to that location, I noticed that the door had been had been forcibly opened, meaning the basically the threshold or the door handle had been pushed open and there was damage to the door. And I learned that the first responders had basically arrived there in response to checking on the welfare of a female who lived in that location. So they go in and then they contain the scene. And again, that's a very, really, really crucial part of this whole issue. So at that point, I was directed to the bedroom. And as you can see, I'm looking at one of the photos. And by the way, those shoes right there next to the victim are in fact mine as I'm standing there next to her. And so you can see that I'm looking at this from a firsthand perspective in terms of what do I have here? And the bigger question I have is, who was it and who was it that let somebody in? And they did it, in my estimation, by way of voluntarily letting them in, or the person, she opened the door and then somebody pushed their way in, because neither the kitchen door, which was their back door, or the front door had been disturbed. So I'm looking at this, I'm saying, wow, who could conceivably have done this? Well, it turns out I learned from, and I hope I'm not going off too far in advance, but I learned that the boyfriend identified himself with the Montebello Police Department and said, I just found my girlfriend in her apartment and she's dead. And then he hung up.
So he called this in. That's how you guys got that tip to show up at the scene.
Correct.
And you mentioned there was a crowd outside already, or was it not until the cops came?
Not until the cops came. Okay. People started wondering.
Got it.
And so at that point, I'm looking at this, and then I learned that there was a number of ropes within a close proximity to the female. I also noticed that on her wrist, as you can see from these photos, you can see, and I don't want to disturb you too much with these photos, but there's what they refer to as ligature markings, which basically means that she had been tied up. And at the same time, her face was badly bruised, her hands and her body was also bruised. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, wow, because I had never had seen something in terms of being so brutally abused. At the same token, the ropes have been removed. So in essence, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, not only did they abuse him, but they also abused her, but they also removed the ropes. And I'm like, wow, who could conceivably go about, and I mentioned this in the previous, in all of my years of doing this, I mean, seeing thousands of dead people, I've never touched a dead body at a crime scene. It's just not my jurisdiction. That's part of the coroner's office. We explained that to you in the previous episode. So I want, and that's a big emphasis for me, because there is nobody in law enforcement that should touch a dead body. That's the coroner's jurisdiction. And I say that in the context of, at least here in Los Angeles County, because we have an interesting relationship with the coroner's office. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but we could go into that later on. So, find her there.
Well, we're sharing the photos, but to describe to those who are listening, we're seeing a young female, and I think you said you identified that she was Iranian by descent.
Correct.
And as you mentioned, there's rope mark. Clearly, she had been tied up. There's bruising around her ankles, around her wrists, and her face is pretty swollen, especially around the eyes. There's a lot of purple discoloration, very disturbing. She's laying flat without any real color or life in her face. Disturbing images, I'm sure, for you, especially to just walk into. One question I had is where's the boyfriend now? He said he called in and said he found her. Is that something that you could tell us later if it's better for the story? But that was the first question that came to my head.
Well, it's interesting because as the story develops, we'll find out.
Okay.
I don't want to be so suspenseful about this, but the sequence of events were such that that I have to go by way of what happened. Excuse me, what happened next, which is I learned from I believe it was somebody in law enforcement. I can't remember specifically, but they said that she had a 4 or 5 year old. I said, well, where is that child now? And they go, we don't know. And I said, okay. And at that point, we know what we have here at the crime scene, but now we got to see if this child is going to be okay. And I'm like, okay, so, and then this was the worst part about this. For some reason or other, inexplicably, they tell me that they're about to tow the car that was parked in their designated parking space in the back of the building. I said, have you checked the car?
Why was the car going to be towed if it was in the designated space?
Again, that was not a decision that I made. And by the way, let me say this, and I go to this in the context of investigations, at least with Sheriff's Homicide, LA County Sheriff's Homicide, that anything and everything that's done is done on the direction of the investigator. Even the crime scene photos. I mean, these crime lab, these criminalists, they know what they're doing. But if you read their reports, they will always preface their reports with, at the direction of the detective. That's the way it works. Now, that being said, I said, have you checked the vehicle, in particular the trunk? And they go, no. And mind you, I'm inside the crime scene. And as I'm like, well, wait a minute. Now, mind you, there is other law enforcement personnel there. I mean, there's probably in excess of 10 people. And
then nobody thought
nobody thought that.
Hold the horses.
This is, so I literally go running out of the apartment and I start running to the back, and here's the truck, a flatbed tow truck. The vehicle's already, I have a photo of it, and nobody was going to take photos of that vehicle. For whatever reason, it was being towed away, and it was on the flatbed, and it starts to drive away. And now, suit and all, I'm running, and I'm telling the guy, stop! And I literally had to run into the street and stop a tow truck.
Oh my God.
And now the big question is there somebody in that trunk?
I mean, think about that timing. Like, if you hadn't found out that she had a son and then asked about the car, or even found out that sequence of events you described, it's incredible. Like, there conceivably could be a child in this car, and the car is getting impounded. Luckily you were there and had the wherewithal of all the law enforcement that was there to put a halt on that.
Right. I actually got up onto the flatbed tow truck, and I was able to open up the trunk, and fortunately there was nobody in there.
Thank God.
Yeah, I mean that would I mean, we talk about an experience, and again, unfortunately I've had the unfortunate experience of seeing a number of dead kids, and in this case, first seeing the mother and then seeing the child would have, and I've seen those situations, by the way, so it's not anything foreign to me, but it is in fact just unbelievably difficult to deal with psychologically. I wanted to mention, we could talk about the court proceedings and the reiteration of everything that went down, but we cannot describe to a jury what you're going through psychologically, because they don't care. You can't be myopic in terms of what you're seeing. You got to look at it from the big picture, and that's the issue here. So fortunately, we didn't find the child in the car. Now the question is, where is the child? Yeah. And we learned that the child was apparently taken by his father, and he was in school. So, but at the time, not only was I about to look in the trunk, but I called our investigative people to try and see who the child was, and at the time we didn't even know who the father was, and so I wanted to find out all of this other information that we had. So there's a number of factors that go into this whole experience. And again, excuse me, I don't want to keep referencing TV programs, but I have to, and that's the reason why I don't watch a lot of these crime scene programs, because it doesn't encompass a lot of the emotional turmoil that goes into an investigation. And I'm talking about dealing with people, directing people, even working with your partner conceivably may have some level of difficulty.
We've been stringing everybody along. You've been stringing us along. Where is the boyfriend? Is he the guy, or is there some other guy? What'd you do here?
Okay. So I look at these injuries, and having done this, over the years, something like this definitely, in my estimation, and I'm not a criminal profiler, which I don't necessarily appreciate that particular type of profession, but there are criminal profilers, and again, that's another story. But I look at these injuries, and I say they're personal, which whoever committed this had to have been in somebody who was personally attacking this person, somebody who knew this person, somebody who in fact was taking some type of revenge on that person. That said, I sent my partner over to the city of Commerce where the boyfriend actually resided. And as I send him there, he's there talking with the adoptive father of our suspect. And as he's there, a phone call comes in, and the boyfriend says to his father, "I'm in West Hollywood at a law office."
Interesting.
And I'm like, okay, so, hey, detective who's at the father's house, get a hold of West Hollywood, tell a couple of deputies go over to the law office where he's at. No, that's not what happened. You would figure that's what would happen, right? I mean, that's an easy fix. No. Hey, Richard, the guy called. He's over at the law office. I said, well, why are you calling me? Here's the point, and this is what I wanted to bring up. He doesn't want to cross that threshold.
Oh my God.
He wants to put me in the he wants to put me in the driver's seat, like I went ahead and made that decision to go get him in custody, because he does not want to be party to this thing. Why? Because he doesn't want to cross that threshold and be scrutinized. So there I am. Hello, West Hollywood. Yeah, what do you need? Well, we got a suspect. Well, okay, now the 20 questions come in. You saw he's a suspect, huh? Is he armed? And I'm like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and I'm listening. And I have to literally, because I could have driven over there, but that's in a traffic day. You guys know Los Angeles traffic from Montebello to West Hollywood. That's about an hour and a half. He'd have been gone in the wind. Yeah. So fortunately, I have these two female deputies go pick him up, and they pick him up, and at that point they put him in the car, and he's crying. And if I remember correctly, I think one of the girls even went to the extent of saying that he actually even tried to hit on her. So this guy, and so we have him in custody, and he was transported over to East LA Station, where I had access to him, because I didn't want to take him to Montebello, but East LA Sheriff Station was not very far from that particular location, so it worked out pretty good for me. So now we have him in pocket. Now I go back. Now pretty much everything is set in place. We know where the little boy is. We have the suspect in pocket, and which, by the way, some of my crime scene photos clearly show the news media there. And we were happy to say and to announce that the suspect was in custody. You get my drift? Once we did that, the level of concern and anxiety within the community was, in fact, reduced considerably. I just want to bring up something, and I think to a large extent it goes to why there's a certain level of empathy that I have for this young woman. A number of years before, I just got on the department, and it's around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I hear this pounding on my door. I open the door, and it's my younger brother. He's only about 16 at the time, and he's crying. I go, "What happened?" And then he shows me his back, and his back had been literally been whipped with a wire. And I'm like, "Whoa, what happened?" And apparently my mother had dated this guy. And I go, "Where's mine?" And he goes, "She doesn't know." So now, when I looked at his injuries, literally, I started to cry. And my first instinct, mind you, I just got on the department, was to go over to that apartment, and that's exactly what I did. And my mother apparently had gotten abused by this man, and then at that point, my brother tried to break it up, and he was whipped with a wire. And I was already armed, and I walked into that house, and the man was there. He was in bed. My mother was not there. And I said to myself, what do I do here? I was confronted by that situation. And I regained my composure, and I walked out, because literally I was about to shoot this guy. And I walked out, and I later learned, I called up Montebello PD, and I said, "Hey, what happened?" And it was interesting, and it goes to this case as well, that my mother refused to prosecute, and she was abused pretty badly, and my brother was just whipped with a wire and scarred in his back. And going to this case, and I say to myself, this one also had a history of abuse, and nothing was done in terms of her trying to get away from this man. And this is what ultimately it led up to. We have a witness that says around 11:30, she heard some rumblings going on in the upstairs apartment, and then at that point it just went quiet. Now, it's evident that the suspect took the little boy back to Commerce, and then around 6 or 7 in the morning called Montebello PD, and he took his father with him, and they drove back to the apartment. The son then walked back into the apartment. Evidently he had the keys, because again, it was not forcibly opened up until the first responders got there. And he, in fact...
you mentioned the son being the suspect.
The suspect, correct, I'm sorry. He then came in, and it's evident that he untied her. I'm not sure why. There was really no need. The damage was done. She had been deceased already. Evidently, his conscience was bugging him. I mean, that's the only way I could interpret his actions. Again, it goes back to my interpretation of a personal attack. Somebody who did this out of revenge, out of spite, out of anger, and certainly out of a level of control, that they lost that control. And I go back to that argument all the time. I would say all criminals that are in fact committing some type of heinous crime on somebody, that it's generally as a result of wanting control. You now have a 5-year-old that in fact witnessed this thing. So he's witnessing his father commit these type of injuries on his mother. That in and of itself speaks volumes about not only what had transpired during the course of his experience, but how he's going to go about living that life post mortem of his mother. We look at it, okay, case solved, suspect in custody, let's all go back. No. There's so much more to this, and I'm telling you right now, and I'm not even, I'm an objective observer, and yet I, to this day, still live with the tragedy that it in fact, occurred that day. So we got the suspect in custody, and I completed our crime scene investigation. Now I go to East LA Station, and we have an opportunity here to talk to him about it, and he refuses. Evidently, he had already, I think he had already acquired an attorney. But that aside, if he had already acquired an attorney, I'm not allowed to ask him any questions anyways. But I am afforded the opportunity to take photos of any potential bruising that could conceivably go away within, a day or two. So in that regards, I did take a few photos, and I did see a number of bruises about his body. Again, because I didn't get an opportunity to talk to him about it, I'm not sure where he sustained those bruises, but nonetheless, you could see that it raised a level of concern that he conceivably was party to this incident. You get my drift in terms of defense wounds. And again, you think about it, here's a woman being tied up, and she's going to have some level of resistance. There was no scratch marks or anything like that on his body, but bruising. And so,
where was the bruising?
There was one. Share. It was one on his upper arm. They believe it was on his left arm. So you can see there's one on his right arm, and as I go,
right bicep looks like there's a bruise there, probably the size of a walnut.
Right, and we looked at his hands, and so you can see there's not much in the way of very visible injuries. We took pictures of his feet. So anything and everything is in fact subject to scrutiny. Because I could see a defense attorney saying, "Did you take pictures of my client?" And yes, we did. Now, did you find anything of any real consequence that would reflect that he had committed this crime? And I'm saying, well, there was some bruising on his arm. Okay, but does that say that he did it? No, it doesn't. It just shows circumstantially that he had bruising, ironically, at the same time that this thing had happened. So in that regards, I'm like, all I can do is provide them the evidence. But we did get preliminary information, as I recall, from the little boy who apparently said that his daddy had committed this crime. And that was our primary witness. Now, mind you, we're talking about a 4 or 5-year-old that can you trust his credibility? Rather than go about browbeating this young man, my practice was to go to a doctor, I believe it's Dr. Lyons from USC. He's a pediatric psychologist. And I take him over to our sex crimes unit down in Colima and Telegraph from South Whittier. And there's a two-way mirror. And I sit on one side of the mirror, and I look at Dr. Lyons interview the little boy. And there's toys and stuff like that. And he basically sort of talks to the little boy, and then they start to talk about the case. Because the child's a witness, there is really no concern for admissibility in terms of whatever the child says. And then at the same time, his grandfather is in fact also present during the course of this interview. But that aside, the young man went ahead, the little boy went ahead and told us what exactly had transpired. And mind you, it's videotaped and recorded, and all of this information is in fact provided to the district attorney's office. Now as we move forward, we can go into, with all the evidence that we've gathered and garnered from this investigation, it's now court time. A defense attorney needs to vigorously defend his client regardless of what the situation is. Because if they don't, they will be remiss. And I think it's primarily for show, but as I sat in court proceedings, not in this case, but in many other cases, where a defense attorney just starts to yell at me. It has no purpose. I had one time a judge tell a defense attorney, would you ask the question first before you start yelling at them? Because it's a show. Yep. They have to show their client that they're vigorously going after them. And the reality is that that has absolutely zero impact on the question itself. The evidence is the answer to the question. It took us 3 years. 3 years to finally get this thing in trial. Suspect's in custody. Okay, the defendant's in custody. Guess what he's doing during that time? He's talking to his son. And, and there's conversations. Again, I wasn't privy to those conversations, but they were going on. And now it's time for the little boy to testify. And he gets on the stand and he starts to cry. And as he's crying, he's like, I don't want nothing to happen to my daddy. I don't want him to get in trouble. And it's evident that the defendant is, in essence, has already manipulated him. So what do? We break out the videotape with Dr. Lyons and we play it for the jury for the purposes of impeachment. Because that was, in fact, the bulk of our case. You have this 4-year-old, and you don't think that's not heart-wrenching? To believe that you're seeing this man, or little boy rather, whose mother is killed and father is, in fact, in custody. He has no connection. His Iranian family, to a large extent, has kind of turned their back on him because of the fact that he's not full Iranian. Again, I ain't going into that culture thing, but this is what I heard. He was down the hallway and he saw his daddy come in and slam his mom's head onto the ground. And the impeachment process and the fact that ultimately that played really large. There was even jurors crying during the course of this particular proceeding just because of what they witnessed. And this is the court proceeding. We don't want to talk about the crime scene and all of those other issues that I brought up earlier in this podcast. We could just talk about that in and of itself. So
you think about what his father is capable of and justice. There is no win in this sort of situation.
Had this guy not been in custody, I truly believe that he probably would have done this to somebody else. To the extent, and I'll just wrap it up here, is that I talked to his previous relationship where he had a daughter from this gal, and apparently she refused to even allow him to see his daughter. And to a very large extent, he was convicted, and at that point he got because they got the torture allegation in. He's doing life without the possibility of parole, so he's not ever going to be out in the streets again. So,
well, I'm glad there was at least justice served, but the sympathies for all involved, and thank you for sharing your experience. Very illuminating to hear from the perspective of a homicide detective, all the angles you have to approach, all the personal biases you have to check. And the elements you have to follow the law, the code of law enforcement and doing right by that and the family.
I appreciate that, Omar. And, like I said, I have a number of these cases that if you want to share some more cases, I'll be more than happy to.
Oh, no doubt.
Alrighty, sir.
Until next time.
Alrighty.
Next time. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, Omar.